Brotherly love. Is it impossible or possible? Today's episode, Jason and I will get into the weeds of how we love each other and where that can take us. Welcome to the 3D Disciples podcast, where we're working together to develop disciples who display God's love as we deploy into God's world. Join us on this journey by liking, subscribing, and following this channel. I'm your host, Hannah, and alongside us is the pastor of FBC Clarion, Jason Hunter. May Jesus help us climb to new heights. Maybe this is obvious to everyone else, but I would say deciding to become a 3D disciple is almost as big of a commitment as baptism. Because when you get baptized, you decide to agree that Jesus loves you. But when you decide to be a 3D disciple, you decide to love everyone else like he did.
Okay. I like that.
Yeah, that's what I saw. So I guess you would agree. That was my question.
No, that's good.
Yeah.
Can I copyright that?
Yeah, right. Because this manual is just stretching me so much. And it's this is sometimes a harder decision than being baptized. And a lot of times in the sermons, you all will say, you all meaning there's been multiple people who have preached about it. You agreed to be a 3D disciple, so this is what you must do. We have those big three things that must. So I don't know. It's a big step.
Yeah. Really, part of the backbone behind 3D disciples that people aren't aware of maybe is it has a connection with another discipleship program that I think I mentioned it a few different times, called Call to Obedience. Mm-hmm. And so I worked with a mentor through Call to Obedience, Randy Murphy from Arizona, kind of discipled me for more than a year. Mm-hmm. Through Call to Obedience, which is a large 3-volume set where it breaks down many of the same lessons that we have in the 3D disciple. So there's a correlation in that. And I had grown up in the church. I had grown up, I had been to seminary. My dad's a pastor. I'm a PK. Pastor's kid. Okay. Yeah. So, literally my earliest childhood memories are in church. I can remember my preschool teachers. I can remember the first Bible that I was given and going to RAs when I was a little kid. So I've been in the church a very, very long time. Literally all my life. And when I was going through Call to Obedience and looking at really what it means to be a disciple, it's really a discipleship program, and it's based on the idea of God gave commands and we are called to obey them. This is what it is. And looking at these things that I've heard all my life, forgiveness and love for others, and how to communicate biblically, and how not to be afraid, and how to, live with faith and humility instead of pride and doubt, and these concepts that I've heard all my life, but that program really breaks it down in some very, very practical steps. And I remember going, man, this is hard. This is, and for one of the first times in my life, somebody really challenged me to let the rubber of my faith and what the Bible taught, really, concretely apply it to my life. And it was hard. It was painful. And I've actually taken a number of people through Call to Obedience on my own. And I can't tell you, but everybody responds the same. I've taken missionaries through it, people who have served, around the world, and they read some of these lessons. I've never taken it that far. I've never taken these lessons that we've heard to the furthest degree and really thought about applying that to my life. And it was hard. And so I'm finding within the 3D, because there's a lot of correlation. I'm actually trying to talk with Murphy, or Randy Murphy, a little bit about actually incorporating some of his information from Call to Obedience into the 3D manual, some QR codes, some graphics that he uses and stuff like that. So we're actually trying to use some of that, and I give some of it out in our sermons sometimes too. So anyway, Yeah, and as I study it, I'm like, man, this is, following Jesus is not for the faint of heart. Doing the things that he really asked us to do, and it's so much more than I think it has become. We've made it really, really easy, and it is easy because it's grace and forgiveness and so forth. There's an easy part to it, but following Christ is quite a challenge.
Yeah, I'm glad you feel that way because the manual is I think, at least for me, it's getting to the meat where I almost find myself sometimes writing what I hear, but my spirit isn't really willing to like do the next step because it's just like, this is asking a lot of me. And like the living selfless chapter that we're discussing at this moment, because we're in brotherly love, that's what this episode's going to be, is not that being nice and kind to people is tough for me, but the kind of brotherly love that Randy's the one who preached on this, is discussing is like, this is beyond like what I have thought was okay to like kind of get by. Well, not even get by. I just thought it was enough. And so, I don't know, living selfless has been my hardest chapter. And I was curious if like you have a hardest chapter in the 3D manual for you.
Well, 1 through whatever we are on right now. I mean, I really am challenged by them all. I mean, I think I wish I could. There's a guy who said one time, or maybe I've said this or thought this, like, I wish, like, in the preaching moment that I could take my heart, that soul inside of me, I wish I could take it out and lay it on the table and show people what's there, but it's kind of got to go through this filter of preaching, and I hate it when people, say, well, you really stomped on my toes. I'm like, you don't realize that I'm up here
stomping on my own.
I'm struggling at times, like, and I've just been overwhelmed, and even preparing this and moving through the 3D Disciple has been overwhelmed with how uncompromising God is about this stuff. Like you said a very important thing just now. You're like, we become very satisfied with a much lower grade of discipleship than what God actually expects of us. And
which this manual has opened my eyes to that. I didn't realize that was a thing.
And I struggle. I ask those questions of myself all the time. I really do. I'm like, man, this is. And I'm the one, and there's a verse that talks about, after you preach being disqualified. I mean, it's a verse that haunts me. Like I don't want to get up and preach all this stuff.
Yeah.
And not do it myself. I mean, I really don't.
Ooh, I never thought about it from your position. 'Cause like like I said, it was a minute ago, like it's hard for me to write it down. And then, because I'm thinking to myself, like, okay, this is going to be tough to do. I can't imagine preaching it. And then everyone's wondering, oh, is Jason doing that? Yeah.
Well, and so I'll make a confession. You asked what's my hardest one. Brotherly love, in a lot of ways, is a very challenging one for me. I find it, for me right now, with where I am in life and the things I'm thinking about and praying about, and as I'm looking at the world, I find it a whole lot easier to love pagans than I do Christians. And like, I'm more compassionate towards pagans, towards non-believers. I'm trying to train myself to be more open and understanding. Like, they're being deceived, they're being lied to. Satan has them where he wants them, and they're in danger of hell. And so I find that when I think about those things, it wells up some compassion for me and a lot of empathy and patience for people who aren't believers. But I have a very hard time offering that same thing to believers, because I'm like, you should know better, you got the Holy Spirit in you, and so so loving brothers that kind of same way is a challenge for me, because I have high expectations for the people of God. I have higher expectation for them than I do pagans, and so that's a significant challenge for me.
That was something I had wrote here too, not in the exact same vein, but similar. Was that it's easier for me to be more loving to like strangers and distant relatives, because my love for them isn't conditional, because they've never done anything typically to hurt me. And so like when you're talking, like Randy's preached a lot on how this brotherly love needs to be unconditional, that agape. And it's it's much tougher to love family when, you know, they hurt you. And so like, I guess, how is brotherly love different from then? How is brotherly love different from just being kind to strangers? Like,
yeah, so brotherly love is that familiar love. It's that love with the people that you share life with every week. You know, and I've said this before, that I believe the church, I've often looked at the church, you know, and God brings a conglomeration of all these different personalities and different together and puts us in a room and says, now all y'all get along, you know.
Thanks.
And that can be challenging because we live with each other and we have our own desires and we're at different places and we have our strengths and we have our weaknesses and we have our good days and we have our bad days. And here we are, like me, having high expectations of one another. You know, like, hey, you just heard, I know what you've read. I've read the same stuff you've read. You know, I've read the Bible. I know what the Bible teaches us to do. You know, and we sometimes hold those expectations over on others. And so, I think really learning how to love one another, love our brothers in this place is really like the practice ground for going out and loving other people in the world. I mean, because loving pagans, you know, I've been thinking a lot about that, but that's tough too, because they do a lot of things that we find really offensive and you know, and that really bother us. And we hold them responsible for the condition of the world. You know, like the world is in a bad place because of all you bad people and, you know, and that kind of thing. And so we can get easily offended at them. And so I think part of why brotherly love is so important, it's a training ground. It's a chance for us to practice all the things that the Bible holds so high. So, you know, one of the phrases I use now is the big three: deny yourself, forgive, and live in unity. Those are three huge things that God expects of us as disciples. Where do we practice those things at? You know, in the body, with our brothers, with those people who we worship with each and every week, those people who we have to set budgets with, and those people who we have to, you know, we've had to figure out how to live life together with. We're connected by this church, and that can be a challenge sometimes. And probably historically, the church hasn't done a great job of that in some cases. You know,
we're working on it.
Well, and I don't mean our church. I mean the church at large.
Yeah. Because
division is something that has plagued the church for a long time, and so you know, it's kind of hard to think about. I remember studying like post-Reformation and like literally there were Christians who had different theologies would meet on battlefields and take swords out.
What?
Yes.
What? And
would like run each other through because you believe this particular theology, I believe this kind of theology. We're going to meet on a battlefield and God's going to, and literally we're going to let God sort it out because we're going to fight with swords and I'm going to.
It's like casting lots. Like
they killed each other. And I'm like, how do they read a Bible that talks about brotherly love and then show up on a battlefield and run a sword through their brother?
No way.
You know, and I'm just like, my mind's like blown away.
I am right now.
And do we do anything really different? We may not use actual swords, but
I hope.
But
I don't see any back there.
But we murder a lot of other Christians.
Yeah.
You know, with our words, with our attitudes. Yeah. You know, and so that we still have some pretty nasty wars out there, and so it's pretty big deal.
And another commandment that Jesus says, there's actually a book that I read, which I would think would be an awesome one to maybe put in our resources. It's called The Mark of a Christian by Francis Schaeffer. Have you ever heard of it?
I know Francis Schaeffer is a pretty heavy duty writer.
I don't know anything more about him other than this book.
He's quoted quite a bit.
But that book was based around John 13, 34 through 35, where Jesus says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." And at the time, that book this is about 8 years ago, I read that. And it kind of blew my mind because I was like, wow, the world won't know who Jesus is if we don't love one another. And then Randy flipped it even more for me, where like for the last 8 years, like I've just been striving to love others by my own strength. And he brought out that, and there's something he said, love one another as I have loved you. It almost seems humanly impossible. And he said, that's because it is. We need supernatural help to do it. And Jesus promises he'll supply us with this help. And like that kind of was like, wow, I needed that breakthrough.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So again, God doesn't command us anything that he won't empower us to do if we're willing. You know, kind of got to welcome that and embrace that. And I don't know if there's a subconscious area that we realize when we really start to really love others, that means self-denial. And so you can't love others and love yourself at the same rate. Somebody's got to take the lead on that. And if we love others, that means we have to decrease, because that's the essence of love, is self-sacrifice, is selflessness. Yeah,
that's something I had actually written here, is like, I see now how chapter 3, living selfless, connects to chapter 2, living spiritually, because you need the self-denial and you need the humility coming from the Spirit. You know, like all of it needs to be, you know, in sync with each other, or it's not going to succeed.
Yeah, and you think about that, even that John 15, it's how amazing that is. And we talk about this in unity, or I'll talk about this in unity, but it applies to love. Again, they all connect and connect and connect. Is that it was the love that Christians had for one another that made the movement of Christ, what the beginning of Christianity, undeniable to society. You know, again, you had Jews and Gentiles, slaves and free, men and women, Samaritans, pagan, you know, all these people who, before they knew Christ, would have hated each other, wouldn't have here's a good Southern saying for you, wouldn't have spit in their mouth if their throat was on fire.
You
know, they detested each other.
Yeah.
You know, and now they're together. They're eating in each other's houses. They're selling their goods to take care of one another and provide for one another. They're worshiping together in the synagogue. They're walking down the street together, you know, and so I think it's that unity that they had, but the love they had for one another, that's talking about there
exactly
in John.
What Jesus said.
Yeah, but and that society who was very caste oriented, you know, who was very like you're this and you're this and you're this and never showed y'all. Society couldn't ignore that, and I think that's what validated the Christian message. Like they're like, these people know something and they're doing something that's undeniable within that movement, and that's what the society, like, something. This isn't just another religion, because we've seen religions come and we've seen religions go, and it didn't change society. It didn't change how people functioned in society. But with the advent of Christ and the love that he showed on the cross, and then the love that the Spirit empowered people to have for one another, that's what people go, wow. And if you read Acts 2, where they're doing all that, and it's like 3,000 people get saved the next day. Like they're just, it's like something is happening because of how they're treating each other. And that's
I wonder how we
amazing.
do that today. Like, I don't know. Ugh. One of my questions I had here was like, I can't believe, or I was going to ask, can you believe that God entrusted us with like that responsibility, that like the world wouldn't know who he was unless we loved one another. But the light bulb for me was like, it's not, yes, it is my responsibility to love, but it's with Jesus's power. And like, I don't know, that was a light bulb for me. So hopefully I can trust in him more to do that.
Yeah. And I think it's an ask.
Yeah.
I think it's something to pray about. Lord, help me love better. I know you want me to love better. I struggle with that. You know, I think sometimes just pouring ourselves out for God and say, hey, I'm willing to love better. Help me do that. I think he's sometimes just waiting for us to ask for that, because we pray about a lot of things. Yeah. You know, we pray about, help me do good on my test this week, or help this person get well, or, you know, I'm really stressed, you know, da-da-da-da-da. But sometimes I think looking at these qualities that God wants to have in us and just saying, hey, look, I recognize that I struggle with this. I'm willing for you to do a work in my life, and I'm actually asking for it. I think that's a real honorable thing that God will answer, because I think that's praying in line with his will.
Yep. So what do we do when we try to love a neighbor that doesn't view our actions as love, but as hate or cruelty? Like, for example, this is just a personal experience of mine. And I have a friend whose sexuality is opposite of what I believe that God says.
Okay.
And so how do I know that if I say something that, is what God views as love or how he wants people to love is opposite of theirs, they're not going to view that as love. So
Right.
How is that brotherly love? I don't know.
Well, the brotherly love is particularly between Christians.
And this is with another Christian.
Okay, who sees that differently.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And you don't have to talk about like that specific. That was just an example.
Yeah, and so that's something we're going to come up against. There's lots of those kind of things. I think you, first of all, have to really settle in your heart how I'm coming at this. And I think there's some wisdom in that too. Like, I really ask, Lord, if God's asking me to say something about it, then I need to say something about it. If God's not asking me to say something about it in that particular moment or whatever it is, that I can just love the person without saying something about it. Again, not having to correct. Like allowing people to. And so,
so sometimes love is correction, but sometimes it's something else entirely.
Right.
Okay.
And so it's the idea of the watchman. This is an idea that really helped me out a whole lot. And so this comes from the Old Testament. And so God sends, I can't remember the prophet right now off the top of my head, but a prophet.
Okay.
He sends the prophet to go to the people. And here's what he says. He's like, I want you to go say this to them, right? To call out this warning.
Okay.
Right? If you do it and they don't listen, then their blood will be on their hands.
Okay.
But if you don't tell them what I've told you to tell them, then the blood will be on your hands.
I remember this story. Yeah.
And so the idea is, if God calls us to say something, we have to say it. And we warn of the danger. We encourage change. Then we leave the decision up to them if we've been sent in that case. And so sometimes, we've got to decide, but we're not always sent to do that. So sometimes I think we can just love. Sometimes if we love long enough and well enough, people will ask.
Yeah.
And then we get a chance to say that. So there takes a lot of discernment. But some people, they want to correct either because they want to be right, or they feel like they have to defend God, and God doesn't need our defense, and so I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, and sometimes being quiet is the loving thing. I won't say always, but I think you really got to check your heart. I think you really got to know what the motivation is and bringing up something like that, because But if you're in a moment and you really feel like, God, I've got to say something, then the loving thing is to say it, and then the response is up to them. So if they miss, if they say, well, that's unloving, well, that's on them and not you. As long as you know the conviction, why you said it in the first place.
And I can see that playing out in church a lot, going back to like, we have to do budgets together and have to do that together. Like, we might say something that, we think is loving, but the other person doesn't respond that way. So I don't know, I guess just not worrying about their response. If God told you to say that.
Right. And it comes down to the motivation of your heart. Is the motivation of your heart to really love the person, to selflessly do what's best for them? Or is it, I'm somehow either trying to defend God or prove my point or want to be right or, and that can be sneaky. It can be, that's a big challenge.
Randy had a prayer that he mentioned at the end where he said that he hoped that you would experience and would come to know the breadth, the width, and the length of God's love for you. And that prayer kind of reminded me of when I got engaged. I bawled my eyes out when Ben did that because
you're gonna do it now.
I haven't thought about it for a while. Because I just couldn't understand that someone could love me that much, that they wanted me, even though how flawed I was. So anyways, And like, I want to be able to do that for people, to like help them understand how deeply they are loved, and to understand that breadth, width, and length of like God's love. And I'm just talking about my husband. I can't imagine trying to understand the amount that God has. So have you ever given or seen this kind of love given through the church?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Can you tell us about it? Can you think of something specific, like a dramatic, life-altering thing?
I've seen it in significant way. I've seen it a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a lot. Really,
That's
if I think back over my life, yeah, and it's usually very quiet, and it's usually not public. So you don't see it publicly very much, because I think, again, when it's public, it can be a little more flash and circumstance. And I'll just give you one. We had a person in our church needed to go to surgery, and they were going to have to travel to Philadelphia for surgery. And our church gave the family a substantial amount of money to pay for travel and the rooms for them to do that. And I watched the parent, the recipient, just overcome that somebody would do something so selfless and so just like, and it was some gas money and room for a hotel, you know, for a little bit, but it was like, I mean, it was enough to cover that, but it wasn't like $1 million.
Yeah.
But I think that meant like worlds to the people who received that, and that was a gift from the church to them. Like, you matter to us as a whole, and we just want you to know. And our church does that quite a bit.
But it's
very quiet, and
yeah.
it happens very quietly. We give out blankets. We have people who make blankets and pray over them, and give them to sick people, and there are people who like, wow, you would do that for me, like you're just on the radar. And so love is it's not necessarily big, and it's not necessarily flashy. But it's a constant that really. I remember as a kid, when my dad was in college and my mom, and they were struggling to make ends meet. And I remember there was a time we were down to half a loaf of bread and half a jar of peanut butter. That was all that was left in our house.
Oh my gosh.
And so we sat down for peanut butter sandwiches that night. And not long after we finished, somebody knocked on the door, and it was our church, and they did this thing called a pounding back then, and that's what it was called.
Yeah.
And they walked in with like 40 grocery bags of food.
Wow.
And just walked into our kitchen and set them down and said, "Hey, we love you," and and then walked out. And I remember like my dad getting a calculator out and like started adding up. Like there was like 10 bags of sugar, and like jars of peanut butter and just canned food, and like just he was just trying to like tabulate how much that they had brought in. And so the Christmas boxes that we send around the world at Operation Christmas Child, these are all just such little acts of significant love that just really display this brotherly love of really caring about each other.
Yeah, and that really open hearts. At the beginning of this episode, we were talking about how hard it is to do brotherly love. But then these stories at the end, you realize it's actually not that hard. And it's pretty cool. I mean, I'm glad we had this conversation, because now I see a little bit more, because I don't see the quiet things that happen. You do, as the position you're in. But brotherly love is just those small things that you don't know how the person, like, it's also back to that discussion earlier about like, maybe the person will see your loving statement as something that's mean, but maybe the loving act that you do, the person will view even larger than what you did. So
yeah, and again, if it's motivated out of real love, I think something spiritual happens there. Like if the Spirit's in it, moving it, he bridges that gap in some kind of way. And that a real loving heart is always perceived by another person's heart. It's when it's not rightly motivated that connection doesn't happen, because you missing the power of the Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the podcast. Our prayer is that you've heard something today that will help you be a better disciple of Jesus Christ. We also want to encourage you to make sure you take your next step in your discipleship journey by considering what it is you would do about what you heard today, and then go and do it. Finally, we want to invite you to join us at 10:30 on Sundays, either at our Main Street campus in downtown Clarion between Dunkin Donuts and McDonald's, or online at FBC Clarion.com. God bless.